So today we're going to talk a little bit about the new imperialism. Well, what does this mean, new imperialism? Obviously, um, there's a long history of empires, and we hear that word imperial, we can think of certainly ancient imperialism, if you're talking about the Roman Empire, uh, or Alexander the Great and the ancient Egyptians or the Assyrians and so forth. Well, obviously, we're not talking about that kind of imperialism. Um, in modern history, there's sort of two phases of imperialism that people usually discuss. I mean, one is, of course, the age of exploration, the empire building that takes place when Europeans venture out in the 15th century, in the 1400s or so, and they certainly colonized the Americas, North and South America, and they established certainly trading posts in parts of Asia and Africa. I mean, some of those trading posts become quite extensive. However, for the most part, they remain really on the periphery, on the sort of outlines of those continents, except for the Americas, where they go in and they create communities and settlements and migrate there. But I think we discussed that enough already. Um, but so really, the new imperialism differs from that earlier phase, from the 15th through the 18th centuries. The new imperialism really is roughly mid 19th century, around 1850 to around the time of the outbreak of World War One. Those are usually the years that are given. Sometimes it varies. And this is really a reference to a period in time in which European powers, sort of the traditional powers that we've already discussed, the English, the French, the Dutch, so forth, expanded their old empires, taking on new territory, but they also developed new markets. They really started to invest in the infrastructure of the areas that they already controlled, as well as these new areas that they began to take control over. And this was also part of this industrialization process. I mean, you really should think about the links between sort of the Industrial Revolution and this new wave of imperialism, because as these empires and countries were developing their infrastructures, they needed more stuff. To put it simply, they needed more resources, more materials, and they wanted to also be able to sell what they were processing back to the same places they were getting the resources from. So this is imperialism in a nutshell. And again, one of the differences here too is that it's not just Europe. It also, now we have Japan building an empire, and also, of course, the United States. And some people might take issue with using a term like empire in reference to the U.S. In my particular view, it does have an empire. It did have certainly an empire. It established markets. It colonized areas. Puerto Rico, Cuba, certainly the Philippines. But we'll talk about that in a bit. It did, in a sense, expand, just like these European powers, although it might have used different language. It might have used different terminology, in terms of the areas it controlled. But nonetheless, it's part of this story too. And one of the reasons why they're moving out, certainly some of the reasons are industrialization, needing more resources and so forth, but also the markets that they traditionally had were beginning to shrink. A lot of these places, and certainly places like Canada and other areas, were now in some cases moving towards independence, or in some cases just simply having more restrictive trade practices, things like tariffs in terms of imports and exports and so forth. So Europeans and Americans and the Japanese and so forth wanted to find more markets to replace the ones that they were, in a sense, losing. So just to give a few examples of the new imperialism. Now, your readings give more detail, and I would encourage you to go back and certainly read that section on the new imperialism to get more of a sense of this. But I just want to kind of run through a few things. A classic example of the new sort of the transition from this earlier phase of imperialism to this so-called new imperialism with England or Britain is, of course, India. And many of you may realize this. I think I might have mentioned it before, but the East India Company, a private company, had certainly had been involved in that whole story of exploration. I mean, when the English and the Dutch investigated North America, it was the East India Company eventually established the West India Company and so forth to colonize in the Americas. Well, in Asia, it was the East India Company, that branch that controlled the areas out there. And again, going back to the early 17th century, 1617, on up through 1857. So, well over 2.5 centuries, this company controlled large sections of the Indian subcontinent. You can see here, I believe, that the dark areas on this map is where the Dutch East India Company eventually established control. And so this is what I meant when I said, the trading posts will become quite extensive. So they start off maybe as trading posts, but eventually they come to dominate and control these areas. They had mercenaries, they had their own armies to help enforce, and they also had support from the English army as well. Now, what winds up happening in the case of India, and similar things happen in other places where Europeans were around this time too. There's an uprising, in a sense, people trying to push them out. In 1857, there's the Sepoy Rebellion, a very interesting revolt. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to go into any detail about it. But what this results in is the British government coming in and replacing the East India Company, kind of similar to, it reminds me a little bit of when the English Crown came in and replaced the Virginia Company in the Jamestown colony, almost 2 centuries before. So it's a similar kind of thing, I think. In any event, Britain comes in and it takes a different approach too. I mean, it really invests in developing the infrastructure of India. So it's not just about controlling areas of territory. It's about building roads, building railroads, hospitals, helping expand cities, because it's viewed that in the long run, this of course will be certainly more profitable, because once they establish a structured or more developed infrastructure, they're going to get people who are going to be working for them and so forth. They will have also more markets in which to sell the goods back. So they're going to extract resources from India, and they're going to, which they've been doing already, and in a sense sell it back to them in the form of products. And this is going to be obviously financially rewarding for them. Just a bigger image of the push east. So they go through from India further east into Indonesia and Malaysia, as does the Dutch and the Portuguese and the French. And all of them had earlier presence there. It's not that they show up in the 19th century. They have missionaries, they have businesses that are already there, going back almost 2 centuries. But in the 19th century, they come in and really establish central control over these areas and begin investing in them. During this time, late 19th century, France goes into Indochina, takes control over what we know today as Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos. So you can see here when the little French flags show you the different dates. So it takes a very long time, but they expand control into these different areas, as do the English very close by. So again, this is typical new imperialism expanding into new areas of control that you had originally had private companies invested in. Now your government is going to take direct control. The Dutch, as I mentioned, also go into Indonesia. The Dutch East India Company institutes this sort of policy, which is sometimes referred to as a culture system. There's two aspects to this. One side of it is quite literally has to do with culture. I mean, they're which is typical of all these European powers, not just the Dutch, but this idea of trying to get the population to adopt your cultural system. So, sometimes they refer to this as cultural colonialism, but this is the idea. So you're going to convert them to Christianity, in this case the Dutch are Protestants, Dutch Reformed Church, and you're going to teach them your language, you're going to get them to dress the way you dress, you're going to get them to be interested in the kinds of products you're interested in so you can sell it to them. You want the population to become increasingly dependent on you. This is typical of the new imperialism in lots of different places. The other part of this culture system has to do with, as in cultivating, as in growing. It has to do literally with crops. And I just wanted to point out, I mean, a particularly tragic example of this with the Dutch East India Company and the native population in Java. Since coffee was so profitable, they insisted that either 1/5 of all crops or 1/5 of labor had to be provided. So if you were a farmer, you either gave 1/5 of your land, or if not, then you gave 1/5 of your time as a laborer to this culture system. It was quite oppressive. Now, what winds up happening is this policy of 1/5 eventually leads to an expansion of coffee production, so that traditional crops that were being grown for food, whether that was rice or some other type of grain, are replaced by coffee, so that they're growing a lot of coffee. What winds up happening is that when the famine hits, it hits really bad, because most of the land is being utilized for growing coffee, which you really can't eat. So I mean, it leads ultimately to something like 300,000 people die of starvation in Java as a result of these policies. Kind of reminds me a little bit of also somewhat later, the English also had kind of a similar policy in Ireland. I mean, they had the population really turn to potato production, which was a profitable crop. It grew in the poor soil there. Most of the farmers went in the direction of growing strictly potatoes, and they gave up a lot of their other crops, whether that was cabbage and other forms of food. And then when a fungus destroyed the potato crops, there was really nothing else for people to eat. And again, this kind of shows how profits could be damaging even on an environmental level. And I guess these are, in different ways, issues that are still with us today. Well, this is just a map showing the U.S. really relates to an earlier point that I was making about manifest destiny. It kind of shows you how the U.S. expanded gradually west. But we've already moved past this. But again, this war, you see the territory that was gained in fighting Mexico in 1848. And eventually, making it to the Pacific. And then it had this whole project that went on throughout the 19th and early 20th century of developing this vast area that today we refer to really as the United States. And as I mentioned, they then move beyond that in many cases, eventually in the late 19th century, leading into a conflict with Spain, which I just talked about. Okay, this image here is part of this topic of manifest destiny, this idea of the U.S. spreading from sea to shining sea. Um, this is an image that appears again and again in a number of different paintings and sculptures and so forth. This is Columbia, and the idea is that she represents reason and knowledge and civilization. You can see in this painting, she's a little like a Greek goddess, and in fact, she's sort of modeled on Athena, I think, a little bit. The idea that as Americans expand westward and take control of the North American continent, they develop it. So you see the railroad here, telegraphs, you see pioneers, the idea that they're going to farm and they're going to really make use of the land, supposedly. Here, Columbia is holding a book, and the idea, again, is her civilizing mission. This was the argument that American settlers and others, as they pushed west and developed the infrastructure, were arguing that really it was God's will in a sense. They were destined to do this. So again, that's really kind of a throwback to an earlier period in history. But I think this sentiment continues on into the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly during this period of the Spanish-American War. So this is what I meant when I was saying the U.S. empire. I mean, as a result of defeating the Spanish, the U.S. Certainly acquires new areas of territory. Puerto Rico was annexed, taken really directly into the control of the U.S., as were the Philippines, further east. This had been part of the Spanish Empire as well. That now became a U.S. territory. It fell under the control of the U.S. Now, Cuba was dealt with a little bit differently. Cuba maintained a certain degree of its autonomy. It became an independent republic. However, the U.S. wrote its constitution. Basically, it took control over, in a sense, its constitutional construction, and it did this really through the so-called Platt Amendment. This was an act that was passed by Congress, Congressman Platt, which ensured that the U.S. would have control over economic and political relations between Cuba and other foreign powers. So in other words, the argument was the U.S. was going to help the Cubans establish a republic, but the idea was that the U.S. felt they weren't ready yet, so if they wanted to establish diplomatic relations with other countries, they had to go through the U.S. first, and if they wanted to trade or do business with other countries, they had to get the U.S.'s permission. So the Platt Amendment essentially guaranteed this. It became kind of written into the Cuban Constitution. Eventually they sort of indirectly, I guess you could say, controlled Cuba, but they really did dominate it politically and economically. Now, part of the Platt Amendment also ensured that certain areas would remain more or less under the control of the U.S. and definitely would become sort of direct parts of the U.S. So, for example, Guantanamo Bay was leased, and the idea was that that the U.S. would indefinitely, in other words, the lease would not end, that it would be an indefinite contract that the U.S. would control Guantanamo Bay, as well as some other areas, which they did later give up some areas, but they kept Guantanamo Bay, which is still under the control of the U.S., even though it's in Cuba, and even though the Cuban government changed over the years, certainly when Castro came to power in the 1950s, in the Cuban Revolution. He wanted to get the U.S. out. Of course, he couldn't quite get them out militarily. He tried to take it to the International Court, but the contract was held up by the International Court. In other words, the Cubans had to really sort of tolerate having this U.S. presence on their territory, and to this day they still do. And of course the U.S. maintains its military base at Guantanamo Bay, which it is now using as mostly as a prison in dealing with these global wars that the U.S. is involved in, primarily in the Middle East. Now, as the U.S. and European powers expanded control of their various empires, or in some cases developed new ones. I mean, I think the U.S., Germany, Italy, Japan, in the late 19th century were really, for the first time, sort of establishing areas of control, whereas the other European powers, had been at it a while. But in any event, when these different powers were establishing control, I mean, how do you rationalize taking control over other people's territory, taking control over their resources and profiting from it? Now, the old argument in sort of the traditional form of imperialism was really one of religion. The idea was that that it was okay. It was okay for Europeans to dominate different parts of the world, take control of them, because they were bringing Christianity to people. They were, in a sense, saving souls. This goes back to the days of the Spanish conquistadors. Remember, that was a kind of almost a religious crusade in many ways, or at least it was billed that way. Now, in the 19th century, though, when you start getting into this very modern period, I mean, this is the post-industrialization, religious arguments don't really hold as much ground. I mean, they're not gone. I mean, certainly in the 19th century, there's lots of missionary activity, and certainly lots of people would have cited bringing Christianity to native populations as a positive thing at the time. However, for those people who really saw religion as something that was of an earlier age, sort of pre-Enlightenment argument, they needed something else. And I think, to a large extent, this idea of social Darwinism plays a role here. So the idea of social Darwinism was that, that essentially there are, some groups that are racially superior to other groups. Now, let me point out something here that's important to know. Darwin is not a social Darwinist, and a lot of students sometimes confuse this a great deal. Darwin, when he publishes, The Origin of Species, when he's talking about adaptation and evolution and so forth, he's talking about plants and he's talking about animals, species, and so forth. Social Darwinists are theorists, and there's a whole bunch of them, and I think some of them appear in your readings, who argue that, in a sense, human beings are not a common species, that it sort of breaks them up into almost different branches, and it breaks it up into sort of these racial branches, but discusses them almost as completely different species in many ways. And, of course, the idea is that certain species adapt to survive. This is something that comes out of Darwinism, absolutely, when he talks about different types of animals adapting to their environment. Social Darwinists then take that in a different direction, and they begin to argue that certain groups of people are more evolved than other groups of people. And this was something that was really rapidly developing as an idea in the late 19th century, just as these empires were expanding. So again, let me just point out a few things. Many of you are probably science students, could explain this better than me, but just to give you a general idea, certain types of animal species, it's argued, survived because they had certain adaptations. So, for example, longer-necked giraffes survived on the plains of Africa because they could reach the higher leaves on trees and so forth. Certain types of birds survived in other areas because they developed the appropriate beak for accessing, insects that were hidden and so forth. This whole argument of finches, for example, is a classic point. I won't get into all that. I think you get the general idea that the idea is survival of the fittest, and that does to some extent come out of Darwin, because he does talk about plant and animal species adapting. But as I said, racial theorists in the late 19th century begin to argue that just as the giraffe's neck is longer and it can reach leaves, therefore it is the one that survives. These racial theorists began to argue that Europeans were entitled to have these empires to colonize Africa and Asia and other parts of the world because they had bigger navies, because they had larger armies, because they had industrialized technology. So the argument is put forth. It kind of fills the same purpose that the old religious argument did for the earlier phase of imperialism. Now social Darwinism, the idea that that Europeans are superior to other groups of people, and also the Japanese, had similar arguments. A little bit different in certain ways, but they also put forth a kind of superiority argument in terms of their empire building. So it's not exclusively European, though certainly mostly. Now, I think if you look at your readings, which I asked you to look at, Cecil Rhodes and Joseph Chamberlain and Rudyard Kipling, you get kind of different perspectives on this issue of superiority and imperialism. They're not all exactly on the same page. They certainly they share the support of empire, the support of imperialism in different ways. But Cecil Rhodes, we'll come back to in a moment, very, very blatant, in terms of making arguments for racial superiority, very unapologetic about forcing people, in a sense, to be subservient, very aggressive kind of imperialist, just using him as an example. And then you have people like Rudyard Kipling, who write this poem, "The White Man's Burden." It's meant to be something that's the message from an old imperial power, if you will, England, which is where Kipling's from, and it's addressed really to the U.S. as it begins to expand as a result of the Spanish-American War, particularly in the Philippines, and which is what this image in front of you is showing. And the argument is, you see. Looks like one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, but essentially it's an American soldier carrying, oddly enough, this is supposed to be a Filipino, up a hill to presumably a school. And again, the argument is somehow that that the U.S. is now on a civilizing mission the way that the English were on a civilizing mission when they conquered different parts of the world, or the French, and so forth. So their argument is that, now here it's a little bit different than somebody like Cecil Rhodes, where they feel that they're doing this really in the interests of the populations, that by building these empires, they are in fact helping. This is the rationalization. This is the argument that many of them are putting forth. Okay, just to kind of summarize a few points, what is it about the new imperialism? Why do they expand so quickly and so suddenly? Well, here I think the answers are fairly obvious. The Industrial Revolution had resulted in major technological advancements. They had better guns, they had machine guns, they had larger guns. They had faster ships, they had railroads, they had telegraphs, communication systems which enabled them to better coordinate their movements. And of course, probably most importantly, too, science and medicine. I mean, they had developed quinine, which enabled them to go deeper into Africa. This was something, uh, you know, that helped them fight malaria, which had kept them out of many areas in Africa and Asia and South America too. They were now able to go deeper into these territories because they could fight whatever illnesses had kept them out. And again, also this sort of sense of invincibility, that this idea of social Darwinism. They believed themselves to be superior. They believed that the fact that they had these technologies somehow was an argument for their right to take control of these different areas. And as I said before, that interpretation varied, depending on who we're talking about. So somebody like Cecil Rhodes and somebody like Rudyard Kipling might have had different approaches to imperialism. Of course, the end product is the same, although they might have viewed their actions differently. In any event, I think certainly social Darwinism, the argument of racial superiority, was also something that kind of motivated them to a large extent. So just to reiterate the differences between sort of the new and older forms of imperialism, as I mentioned before, the old imperialism, 15th century to the 18th, 1400s to the 1800s. Largely we're talking about settlement of the Americas, but for the most part, goods and resources outside of the Americas, if we're talking about other parts of the world, Asia and Africa, goods and resources were bought from natives, from indigenous populations. Trading ports were established along coastal areas, resources brought back to the empire. Again, an emphasis on settlement in places like the Americas. The new imperialism, again, mid 1800s, 1850 to early 1900s, 1914. Now they take direct control. They're not private companies necessarily hanging around the coastal areas, but they are moving deeper into Africa, deeper into parts of Asia, deeper into the Indian subcontinent, expanding control. And more too, the idea of empire is taking on, large part thanks to social Darwinism, certainly is part of it, taking on a kind of racial context. And, there's a difference. I mean, if you look back at the Spanish and French empires, for example, in the 15th and 16th centuries, as they were establishing control, populations mixed, for example. Europeans took Native American wives or Native Asian wives, so forth. They established communities. One of the differences, I think, with the new imperialism is there's a sort of racial difference there, where they start to really see each other as different, as one being somehow superior to the other. So there is a fear of race mixing, which makes, I think, the kind of social hierarchy, it reinforces it in many ways. Certainly there was a social hierarchy before the concept of race and before social Darwinism became sort of a system of theory. But there's a kind of new version of that, I guess you could say, which has with it its own disturbing elements. Again, the process of the new imperialism, this idea of investing in underdeveloped areas, building the economy, transforming the economy, employing native or indigenous peoples in your industries, in your businesses. This way they become more dependent on you. So people are no longer farmers or in some cases hunter-gatherers. I mean, depending on what part of the world we're talking about. They now are, working the assembly line in a factory, for example. So they stand to lose a lot if that factory pulls out. So this is really, building a dependency this way. You have really kind of guaranteed control of an area. That's a classic feature of the new imperialism. Um, the country itself, in a sense, becomes dependent. Usually there's a local middle class that develops. I think you certainly see this in India and in certain parts of other parts of the world where they identify really to a large extent with the rulers. Not everybody, but certain aspects of the so-called educated or wealthier class. Um, then becomes sort of in a sense dependent. They manage to have local power, but they need the Europeans or the Americans to support them, to keep them in a position of control within their local communities. So that's also part of the process of the new imperialism. I have here a slide of Queen Liliuokalani, who was queen of Hawaii, who was overthrown by a group of American sugar planters. Um, and I just put it here as kind of a classic example of again, the new imperialism, in this case, the U.S. version of it. And she was overthrown in 1893. I have a little video clip here, which I'll have to go back. I think I'm going to add this to your folder on Blackboard, so that you could watch it if you want. But it's again, she was really overthrown by the Dole plantation company, which is still with us today. And eventually, once she was overthrown, they established a separate Hawaiian republic with President Dole, the head of the Dole Fruit Company, became president of Hawaii. Eventually, he did cede it over to the United States, and Hawaii, of course, eventually became a state in the U.S. So I just included the slide here, but again, I'll see if I can get that video clip into your folder. For the new imperialism, again, economic. There were limited markets. They wanted to expand as a result of these new limitations that were being put on them. Certainly, there are elements of the traditional imperialism that still are relevant in the new imperialism. I think certainly missionaries, wanted to spread Christianity. I mean, that certainly continued. It didn't end, even if social Darwinism was being used as an excuse in many cases. Nonetheless, religion was still there as well. This issue of the social question, social policy, the idea that by creating a powerful empire and bringing back more resources to your home base, you could, in a sense, ease existing social tensions. So, as these empires were expanding, you had people back in the home countries in England and France and Germany and other places who were arguing for rights. I mean, women wanted voting rights. The working classes wanted greater representation, political representation. They wanted fairer wages. They wanted better living conditions. And one of the ways that you could sort of weaken these tensions was to, one, have people take pride in creating these powerful empires. So they might be low on the social scale in England. They are somehow superior, though, to these other parts of the world, to the people in these other parts of the world who are now part of their empire. This was one of the subtle messages of imperialism. The other thing, national pride too, was certainly something that they encouraged. So there were a lot of, there's a lot of reasons for motivating it. Plus, there's a practical sense. If you're bringing back more resources, you can, in a sense, invest in building public works and even, public schools and develop your infrastructure. So that also sort of removes certain tensions. There were also strategic reasons for expanding. Europeans were busy fighting with each other, so having bases, for example, spread out in different parts of the world enabled them to get an upper hand on one another. Okay, so by 1914, by the time World War I broke out. 7 additional European powers had established colonies in Africa alone. You can look at the dramatic change in this map here. These included France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Belgium. The only areas of Africa that were left uncolonized, in other words, that weren't taken over by Europeans, were Liberia, which was under U.S. protection because it had been created as a safe haven for freed slaves. This goes back to an earlier period in U.S. history in which former slaves were sort of encouraged to go to Africa and create a series of settlements. Eventually, those different settlements combined and formed the country of Liberia, short for liberty, I guess you could say. So certainly Liberia wasn't invaded or taken over by European forces because of that sort of unique relationship it had with the U.S. The other was Ethiopia, which had already sort of centralized itself. It had become a fairly developed country with a fairly strong army under King Menelik the Second, who was king of Ethiopia. His army had managed to drive out European invaders in 1896. I mean, these were Italians, by the way, who had attempted to invade and colonize Ethiopia. They drove them out, and they defeated the Italian army, and were able to really, in a sense, maintain their independence. And again, a lot of this had to do with the fact that they had sort of centralized and had a certain degree of modernization, which enabled them to fight the Europeans. They would be invaded again later in World War II when the fascist Mussolini took power. And well, that's a story for another day. I'll leave that. But it was to some extent an act of revenge, really. We'll talk about that later. But certainly, you can see this difference between 1880 and 1913, and this is what they mean when they talk about the scramble for Africa, which I'll have a few more things to say about that. Okay, so as Western powers began to expand their control, particularly in Africa, expanding into controlling large sections of Africa, tensions begin to develop. Now, what triggers this all? It's actually the result of one of the smaller European countries. Belgium, of all places, really triggers this race that takes place. I mean, not exclusively, but certainly Belgium plays a large role in the tensions that develop, leading to sort of expansion of control in Africa anyway. And certainly the new imperialism involves other parts of the world, but a big part of this is really the expansion and control of Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium hired the English explorer Henry Morton Stanley. If you recall, I don't know if you will, but you can see it in the outline that I'll post later. The first image I had in this slideshow was of Henry Morton Stanley being served by a young African boy. Actually, the African boy was his adopted son. There's an interesting story behind that. Fairly complicated story, but anyway, Stanley plays this major role. I mean, he's hired. Stanley is this adventurer. He's an explorer. He originally came from Scotland and then migrated to North America. He took the name of a wealthy American that had taken care of him, because Stanley himself was an orphan from Scotland. So that's all an interesting biographical notes, but in any event, he goes on to become sort of a person involved in the press. I mean, he's a reporter. journalist, I guess you could say. He goes out and then becomes a kind of adventurer, and then he would write these stories, and they would come back to the U.S. and be published in various newspapers. And so different people took an interest in him. King Leopold of Belgium hires him to go and stake out claims in the Congo, in the interior of Africa. And what winds up happening is, Stanley finds rubber deposits, others find rubber deposits there, and rubber was really an ideal thing to discover at this point in time, because they were just really, bicycles were becoming more popular. People were buying them. They needed rubber to certainly make the tires, but also a lot of machines that they were using as a result of the Industrial Revolution also began to use rubber for various purposes. And of course later on, I mean not right away, but later on, of course, cars are going to require rubber. And there'll be a million things that people can use rubber for, and it winds up being really a big cash cow, if you will, for the King of Belgium, because Henry Morgan Stanley goes in, he gets people to sign treaties, manages to secure large stretches of territory and land for Belgium. I'll come back to Belgium in a moment, because there's another video clip which I want you to watch about some of the atrocities that were committed on behalf of King Leopold II in the Congo. But we'll come back to that in a bit. So these profits begin to emerge as a result of rubber deposits. Also, the English then move into southern Africa, where there had been, I'll talk about this in a moment, where there had been earlier Dutch, a kind of mixture of Dutch settlers who had created these independent African republics. And the English then go in and try to expand into control with the help of Cecil Rhodes, looking for different resources. And they find diamonds. So on the one hand, you've got the Belgians with their discovery of rubber in the Congo, and on the other hand, you have the English expanding their control into South Africa, finding large diamond deposits. Of course, this sets everybody off on a kind of mad race to take control over Africa, because there's so much financial gain there. Now, what winds up happening is, as the different European powers begin to scramble for control of this area, they begin to bang heads. They begin to come into conflict with one another. Now, initially, Portugal winds up having a dispute with a number of other countries, I believe Spain and France, over particular areas of territory in Africa. It almost comes to an instance of war. And this sort of thing is happening again and again. And what winds up happening is that a large conference is organized in Europe by our old friend Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor of this newly created country, Germany. By the time of the Berlin Conference, it's only been around probably 14 years or so. It is also now an empire. And Bismarck and Germany, since its defeat of France, is sort of the dominant power in Western Europe. And this is why this conference takes place in Berlin. And this is why Bismarck plays such a major role in events in Africa. Representatives from all over Europe come to the meeting, including the U.S., and the idea is, how is colonial expansion going to be handled? I mean, how can they prevent war from taking place between the different European powers? And Bismarck comes up with this idea of effective occupation. He in a sense says you can't lay claim to an area of territory in Africa or for that matter, in other areas as well. It's not just Africa, but most of the issues here were focused there at the time. Uh, the idea was that you needed to show that you had invested in the area in order to lay your claim to it. So the idea is you had to have something. You had to have a railroad. You had to have um, factories. You had to have some kind of infrastructure that you invested in the area in order to claim it as your territory. And he gets the other European powers to agree to this. And part of the result of this agreement is that they essentially race off and they begin trying to get into these areas first so that they could, in a sense, establish some type of infrastructure so they could lay claim to the area. And of course, initially it's just a question of establishing control, so that they could take control of the area. But eventually it also leads to this idea of developing markets that I talked about before. I mean, which is also the classic attribute of the new imperialism. So they begin to carve up these areas, and they begin to, in a sense, create new borders, and they establish, really, in some cases, countries where they weren't countries before. Which creates all kinds of problems which remain with us to present day. I mean, all kinds of ethnic and cultural conflicts because of these sort of unnatural borders that the Europeans drew up in different parts of Africa. We'll probably talk about some of that a little bit later in the semester. Now, the other thing that Bismarck is doing here, and the reason he plays such a major role, and of course, I mean, Germany does take the parts of Africa for itself as well, Southwest Africa, which you'll see in those video clips. We'll talk about in a moment. It's also about Bismarck's European policies. He's very much interested in Germany being sort of the main go-to country for diplomacy, for strategic political alliances, and so forth. He's interested in keeping France isolated. You remember there was this Franco-Prussian War, which had resulted in the creation of Germany at the expense, really, of France to a large extent, with the defeat of Napoleon III. And what he wants to do is create a system of alliances that would enable him to keep France weak, because what he's afraid of is having enemies on two sides of Germany, because Germany is a landlocked country for the most part. I mean, it has access to the water in the North Sea, but most of it is surrounded by other European countries. So he uses this mission of expansion in Africa. He uses this so-called Berlin Conference as a way of sort of establishing Germany's security in Europe, while at the same time playing sort of world diplomat in Africa. So the Berlin Conference is important for a number of different reasons, and we'll probably come back to this when we talk about World War I a little bit, because it's directly the system of alliances that are sort of created as a result of the Berlin Conference. Also factor in on events leading up to World War I. Again, this is just another image of the so-called partition or scramble for Africa, which I think gives a slightly clearer view of who occupied what areas. And you can see here, there's German Southwest Africa down here. So there certainly the Germans carved out areas. There's also German East Africa, but actually comparatively, they actually don't have as many colonies as certainly the Spanish and the British, or I should say the British primarily control large areas. The French, as you can see, control large sections. It's not that easy to see here, but here you see the Belgian Congo. In the area they controlled in Africa, this is where they found all the rubber. The area they controlled in Africa, many sizes bigger than tiny little Belgium, that's for sure. So again, as you can see, pretty much all of Africa completely colonized. Some of the points in this slide are fairly repetitious. I've already talked about this, but it's the image that I found kind of interesting. This is an image of Cecil Rhodes, and again, Cecil Rhodes is an imperialist, but also, very aggressive racist. I think you'll see that in the primary document I asked you to read. And Rhodes has this idea that he's going to help establish control for England. He's in a sense living in one of the Dutch republics. It's a complicated story, but eventually what Rhodes wants to do is run essentially this massive colony from the north of Africa to the southern tip of Africa. His vision is to conquer all of Africa for England, but it would involve him becoming kind of a sort of viceroy, a ruler really of all of Africa. That was part of his vision, much the way that, say, the Dutch East India Company at one time had controlled India. He sees his company, which, by the way, was the De Beers, what would become the De Beers Diamond Company, which is still with us today. That was Rhodes' company. He had gone into business with De Beers. It's a long story, but in any event, he really saw his own sort of his private company as controlling, all of Africa on behalf of England. Anyway, that's what this image projects. Of course, the English weren't interested in doing that. They certainly used Rhodes for their purposes, but they eventually took control of these so-called Afrikaan, these Dutch-speaking republics. The Transvaal and the Free Orange State. These were countries in Africa that were dominated by white settlers who, again, most of them were Dutch. It was not a colony of the Dutch, though. It was sort of an independent settlement community that took control and also involved other Europeans. He helps push them really out as a political force and bring the English in, which is sort of the history of modern-day South Africa. Which is kind of a combination of Dutch-speaking and English-speaking cultures that mixed in, of course, with the African indigenous population. I didn't say mixed in, but controlled them. Well, that's a somewhat complicated history I can't get into right now. Maybe we can come back to it later. But the point I want to make is, again, this role that Rhodes plays. By the way, the Rhodes Scholarship was established by Cecil Rhodes. The objective of it was to secure. It was a kind of racist incentive behind it to secure fellowships for English Protestants. There was all this kind of racial criteria that was applied to the Rhodes Scholarship. No longer is that racial criteria applied, but this was a man who definitely left behind a kind of, or tried to leave behind a kind of racist legacy. The country Rhodesia, of course, got its name from Rhodes. That was an area that he had established control in. So disturbing but interesting figure. Now, part of this story of the scramble of Africa, which is what I was trying to talk about here in bringing Cecil Rhodes into this discussion, is it does lead, despite these efforts to supposedly prevent conflict, it does lead to conflict in many ways. And it also reveals some of the more disturbing elements of modernity, some of the atrocities that are going to develop. So, for example, there are the Boer Wars, which take place in South Africa. Transvaal was one of these countries that I was just talking about, these Afrikaans, these settlements that were established by Dutch settlers, as was the Orange Free State. So there's two Boer Wars. One fought mainly in Transvaal, trial between 1880 and 1881, and another between 1899 and 1902, where the English come in, and they eventually do defeat the Afrikaan, the Dutch-speaking population, and they really use brutal policy to sort of exert control in the area. They destroy civilian farms. I mean, they burn down people's property. They push people. They slaughter civilians. At one point, they push something like 155,000 men, women, and children. These are, Afrikaans. These are the white Dutch-speaking settlers for the most part. They imprison them in what would later become termed concentration camps. The first time that word is used is actually used in the Boer War, when the English established these camps for the Afrikaans, and when they imprison them in these camps, the conditions are so bad. I mean, they're not feeding them properly. That disease breaks out, typhoid and other illnesses, which results in a huge loss of life. Something like 28,000 Afrikaner women and children are killed in these camps, and you can see this image here. It looks like something from a much later period. It looks like a Holocaust image, but just goes to show you just how bad conditions were for the people in those camps. They were really brutal, and of course it wasn't limited to the white Afrikaan population. They also imprisoned something like 14,000 black Africans in South Africa in these internment camps, people that were seen as allies of the Afrikaans. Whether they were allies or not isn't absolutely clear. I mean, it doesn't matter in any event. They were imprisoned there, and they also died. So again, a kind of disturbing image of what was to come in the 20th century. And again, we see that the brutality that can kind of come out of the combination of imperialism and this sort of nationalistic obsession. Brutal. Also, we have to jump back to this earlier point that sort of ignited this scramble for Africa, getting back to Belgium. Remember King Leopold II, with the help of Stanley, had established control of the Belgian Congo, something like, between 1885 and 1908. This huge region in Congo was actually the personal fiefdom of King Leopold II. So it actually wasn't really a colony of Belgium. I mean, we call it it would eventually become a colony of Belgium, but for much of its history, it's actually the personal property of King Leopold II. He controls this huge region, and he uses mostly mercenary troops, so not the regular Belgian army, although they would later get involved. But he uses his own private fighting forces to hold control of that area. Now, this is also one of the first, really major genocides. And of course, one can debate what's the first genocide to some extent. I mean, certainly huge numbers of Native Americans and indigenous people were killed in the Americas, and even at this time, they were being certainly killed in large numbers. But probably this is one of the worst for sure, and something like 10 million Africans wind up dying as a result of Leopold's policies. Granted that's over a sort of 20-year span, but still, something like a drop in the population of 10 million, and certainly, this is the result of a number of different factors. One, when you're forcing people to collect rubber, they're not doing other things that need to be done to sustain a population. Now, I've included a video clip which I'd like you to watch about the atrocities in the Belgian Congo. So maybe I'll just let the video do my talking for me in that regard. But certainly it's a disturbing feature of it's the late 19th into the early 20th century. I also included a video which I'd like you to watch about the German colonies, the areas where the Germans controlled in Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, Cameroon, and Togo in 1884. And also in East Africa, they had established control in modern-day Tanzania. Now in German Southwest Africa, you had this genocide that took place also that often isn't really discussed that much. The Herero and the Nama people, and a number of other groups in this region where modern-day Tanzania is, rebelled, tried to push the Germans out of this region. Some of them did attack German settlers, which was a good rationalization or excuse for the German army under the control of General von Trotha, who you see here in this picture. He winds up issuing this extermination order, in which he essentially orders, the entire Herero population to be killed. Something like anywhere, we don't know exactly how many, but somewhere between 24,000 and 100,000 Herero are believed to have been killed, and about 10,000 of this other group of people known as the Nama in this part of the world were also killed. And he points out, and you'll see this in the video clip, that even children aren't spared. I mean, this idea of a complete brutal suppression of the population. And I think clearly, again, if you look at social Darwinism and this idea of arguments for racial superiority and so forth, play a role in this. That's not necessarily the reasoning behind removing the population. I mean, but clearly they are not viewed as equals. They are not viewed as fellow human beings, which certainly enables this horrible action to take place. So, clearly some disturbing elements emerge in these conflicts in Africa. So imperialism brings certainly some disturbingly modern characteristics. When we think of events later on, like in the Holocaust, for example, we see really the precursors to that in this sort of beginning imperial period. It's kind of a signal for what's going to follow in the 20th century. And also, I've been talking about Africa here for the most part in describing some of these sort of genocidal actions. But to get back to this other point about Native Americans in North America too, which people sometimes forget, that's really going on roughly around the same time. So this issue of sort of expanding and developing the infrastructure in North America also brings sort of similar atrocities as the kinds of atrocities that you see in the Belgian Congo or in South Africa or in German Southwest Africa. Here we have a disturbing image which you may have seen before, but this is of the Wounded Knee Massacre. Several hundred, mainly women and children, were slaughtered by U.S. soldiers in 1890. The bodies were dumped in mass graves, as you can see here in the picture. And again, this was sort of the result of larger Indian removal policies that were going on in Dakota at the time. Granted, it was a specific incident that might have triggered it. They were looking for a particular group of Native Americans, warriors and so forth, that weren't there, supposedly. But the point here is, again, looking at the new imperialism, looking at this period in terms of industrialization, in terms of developing the modern nation state, what constitutes these nation states, who belongs, who doesn't belong. Um, Again, we see a kind of, this is 10 years before the 20th century, so this is, part of this larger story of the changes that were taking place in the world at the time. And I just like you to kind of try to keep it in the same perspective. It isn't, these wars on the plains aren't necessarily a completely different, they're certainly not a different period of history, they're the same period of history as the story of colonial expansion into Africa and Asia and India and other parts of the world. So these things are all really happening at the same time, and should really kind of, I think, be thought about really in terms of expansion, race, industrialization, and development. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. A few terms that I think you should know. Um, a few things that came up in my little talk here. I'll post this in the outlines. And again, just try to think about how the new imperialism really differs from the earlier forms. That's certainly something to really consider as we move on into our next topic, which will bring us a little bit closer to the First World War. And please go back and look at these other video clips, which I'm going to include in your folder. Certainly take a look at the Heart of Darkness and about the Congo, about the short little, they're segments, and the quality and that might not be that great. It's on YouTube, of the Herero genocide that took place in Southwest Africa. I'll try to include the clip on Hawaii if I can find it, and try to just keep in mind as you're watching these things. I mean, what does it tell you about the new imperialism? What are the connections between empire and this sort of dehumanization that takes place in many places? All right. Well, thanks for your attention. I wish you a pleasant day or evening. And I will be back next week with another topic, but I'll be in touch with you on Blackboard.